18 years after Thompson's initial paper on a defense of abortion, we get another really famous paper, this time a pro-life argument. And what's really important about this paper is that it's a secular pro-life argument. It's not going to rely on some kind of status of the fetus as having a soul or anything like that. And like Thompson, it's going to kind of dodge this whole personhood debate too. It's a really, really interesting paper, and it really does a nice job of like pushing back on Thompson's view, but also giving a really nice dialectic between the two views. So let's talk about it. So the paper is from a philosopher named Don Marquis. Yes, it's Marquis, not Marquis. I don't know. He knows how to say his own name, I assume. So it's Marquis. This is, as far as I'm aware, this is his most famous work, and it's gained a lot of traction. It's still a really important paper to think about and talk about, much like Thompson's paper. Now, in a lot of ways, what we'll kind of see is that they're sort of talking past one another, but it's this really nice back and forth about like how do we identify the morally relevant features of an abortion. So the first question that that Marquis is going to ask here is a wonderful, wonderful question that I feel like only a philosopher could ask. I love philosophy so much because you get questions like this. Why is death, like especially premature death, like such a bad thing? Like, goodness gracious, what a silly question to ask, right? But then you're like, well, hang on a second, what is it about premature death that's such a bad thing? Well, maybe it's the harm to the victim's family. Well, no, because like it would still be a bad thing even if the victim had no family or friends or anything like that. What about the brutalization of the killer, right? Like you kill somebody and suddenly you're a murderer, right? That's a thing. And it's like, okay, yeah, but that seems to get the explanation backwards, right? It's a bad thing for the victim. Sure, like maybe the killer's brutalized too, but that's not really explaining what's going on here. Okay, well maybe it's the loss of biological life. And Marquis is like, well, no, because like there's not much of a difference, say, between like, just dying or like being in a coma for like the rest of your natural life and then dying. Like, as far as you're concerned, right, there's really no difference between those two things. So what is it that is going on when somebody dies, prematurely, like before their time or whatever? Marquis's answer here is that they have been deprived of something, the loss of future goods of consciousness. These future goods of consciousness are all kinds of things that we will like subjectively come to value. Projects that we've finished and goals that we've obtained, beautiful things that we've seen, all kinds of friendships and, just whatever it is that makes your life worth living. For me, it's probably video games and maybe garlic mashed potatoes. I don't know. But like, whatever it is that like keeps you going, those are your future goods of consciousness. And so what's happening here is when somebody dies, before they get to like experience all of those goods of consciousness, right? They're being deprived of that. The killing, the premature death, deprives someone of something of value. It's almost like stealing in a sense, right? Like when you take something from me that I have, you're depriving me of something that would have like brought me joy, that would have like, made me happy. And it seems like a very similar idea here. So the way, the sort of principle that this idea hinges on is you are depriving an individual of something called a future like ours, a flow. So here is how the argument would go. Killing anything with a future like ours, with a flow, is a serious moral wrong. A fetus has a future like ours. Abortion is killing a fetus, so abortion is seriously morally wrong. Definitely valid argument. And we can start to now think about, is this sound? What premises would we engage with? How could we push back on this? I don't want to push back on premise 3. I imagine there are some of you guys who, might do biology or sciencey stuff that could maybe push back on premise 3, but I'm not in a position to do that. I'm happy to kind of grant that abortion is killing a fetus. And it seems like premise 1, maybe Marquis is sort of already argued for. This is what makes death like such a bad thing, or premature death, I should say, such a bad thing. So it really seems like it's coming down to premise 2. A fetus has a future like ours. Isn't this just a potentiality argument? Isn't Marquis just saying like, hey, a fetus has like potential, goods, a future or whatever, like it's all about like what's going to happen to it? Not quite. This is something that is really, really important to understand. This is definitely something I will ask about on a module test, and something that you will need to explain in detail and have a rich understanding of. Why isn't Marquis's argument, technically speaking, why isn't it a potentiality argument? If you remember, and you can go back and look through those slides on the potentiality argument, it's premise, I think it's premise 3 that says that a fetus has the potential for some property like personhood, right? And in virtue of having this potential, it has the rights conferred by that property. So the fetus is not a person yet, but it will be. And so it has those rights of personhood. This is not what Marquis is doing. The property in question is having a flow, a future like ours. And a fetus already has it. It is not about the potential for some property. A fetus already has a flow. So technically speaking, it is not a potentiality argument. Now, you can sort of quibble about like, well, what is going on here? How can we establish that a fetus has a flow? And that's fine. But like, as it's structured, it's not going to be a property that we acquire later. It is a property that a fetus already has. Now, what's cool about this is the flow argument kind of gets a lot of intuitive cases right. I think it does a really clean job of explaining why murder is such a heinous act, right? This deprivation is a really big deal. Notice, too, that if I'm just like asleep or in a temporary coma or something like that, I still have a future like ours. I still have a flow. By the way, people who might be suicidal, we can respond to them appropriately. They are in a position to where they might think they don't have a flow, but they're just wrong, right? They will come around and like things will get better. And so they do have a flow. They just aren't in a position to appreciate it yet. But if we've got a patient who is suffering, who is at the end of their life, who is maybe terminally ill, and they just genuinely do not have a future like ours, they do not have these future goods of consciousness, then euthanasia, or what we might call like doctor-assisted suicide or whatever, this could be morally permissible. And a lot of people sort of share the intuition that it might be. And so this flow argument gets that case right. Now, if you are against euthanasia, it gets this case very wrong. But most people tend to like find this at least intuitively compelling. And finally, and I think this one sort of, this appeals to me a lot, is like, it gets animal welfare into an interesting position because it's a future like ours, right? It is compatible with certain experience, certain kinds of like conscious state that non-human animals could experience, and can explain why, like, say other primates like gorillas and chimps and bonobos and things like that, why other primates are, that are so much like us that they might genuinely have a flow. And we might genuinely be able to make an argument that says like, hey, it is not cool to keep these animals in zoos, right? It also kind of gets to this idea of just general animal welfare. You know, why killing certain animals might not be okay, because again, they might have a future that could be sufficiently like ours. At least Marquis kind of leaves it sort of up in the air, and I think that's a really interesting move to make. And I mean, I'm biased here. I do love animals, but it's definitely something to think about. Now, worries for the view. It could be the case that Marquis is just sneaking potentiality in through the back door, and I think this is an argument that is a really, really interesting one to make. You know, because again, we're talking about like future goods, right? We're not talking about goods that we actually have in the moment. We're talking about goods that we're going to get. I do want to like flag something really quickly. So let's say we're doctors and we've got a patient and they're in a coma and we can't tell like whether or not they're going to come out of a coma, but like our best evidence that we have right now suggests they're not. They're done. And so, you know, we inform the family or whatever, they consent, and we go ahead and, you know, pull the plug or whatever you do as a doctor to sort of end their life. And it turns out we were wrong. That like, oh, just around the corner maybe there was some medical technology that would have saved this patient's life. Those are genuinely interesting worries, but they're what we would call epistemological worries. Worries about knowledge. That's what epistemology is. And it can be the case that we're just not in a position to know whether or not something has a flow, whether or not something has a future like ours. We can make educated guesses based on the best evidence available, but we might be wrong. And this can work in favor of Marquis, especially if we're considering like non-human animals, but it could be a problem for his view, right? If he's like, hey, here's this standard of morality, you don't kill stuff with a flow, and then it turns out, oh, it's not very easy to tell if things have a flow or not. So there's a little bit of tension there. And one other thing that I'll kind of highlight, this is something that Marquis himself talks about. If you just sort of had to pick, I'm not saying this is a great scenario, but if you had to pick between, you know, your car's, you know, brakes have failed or whatever, and you're out of control, and you've got to either hit a 7-year-old or a 70-year-old, most people are probably going to hit the 70-year-old because it's like, oh, you know, well, he's already lived like a long life. The 7-year-old's just a kid. He's still got a lot of life left. Here's the thing, though. Flow doesn't come in degrees. You either have it or you don't, right? And this is kind of a really important part of like his view here. And so if flow doesn't come in degrees, then the 70-year-old has a flow. So does the 7-year-old. And so a flow by itself can't explain sort of the degrees of wrongness here between killing a 70-year-old and a 7-year-old. And Marquis fully acknowledges this point. He's like, look, there are other wrong-making features of this act that we can sort of identify. It's like a flow is just a starting point, and a flow is what's relevant to the case of abortion. And again, so what's really nice about this is we don't have to, you know, it's a completely secular pro-life argument. We don't have to, you know, first convince somebody that God exists, right? That would be, you know, a not ideal argument to try and get off the ground. So it's a wonderful, wonderful argument. I think both of these arguments are really, really cool, really fun to think about. I'm excited to see what you guys have to say about them in our discussions and stuff online. So just a quick recap of everything that we've talked about. We did the philosophical landscape, the pro-life, pro-choice hardline, and with exceptions. We looked at bad arguments on both sides. And remember, what makes these bad arguments is that they just wouldn't convince somebody who doesn't already agree with your point of view. We looked at Judith Thomson's defense of abortion and the violinist analogy. She has lots of different analogies in her paper, but the violinist one is the most famous one, and it's, you know, it's supposed to be analogous to a pregnancy as a result of sexual assault. And we've just talked about Don Marquis and his flow argument, his future like ours argument, that's going to present a pro-life position. So that's going to do it for this module. Again, I really look forward to hearing what you guys have to say, and I guess I'll see you guys in the discussions.